name's Annette. I work here in the Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health in the Clinical Center, and I'm currently in my third year of a fellowship there, working primarily on treatment decision-making for incapacitated patients, that's one of the projects, so not primarily, and the other one is risk assessment and research, and this is what I'm going to talk to you about today. My background is in medicine, so I'm a physician. I worked in Germany in a neonatal intensive care unit, so in pediatrics, and then at some point I switched into bioethics and was previously based at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, and that's where I'm going back this fall. And so currently I'm here, and one of the major areas of my work has been risk assessment and research, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. I just wanted to say, I think Henry already mentioned, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to interject either by chat or by raising your hand, and I'll try to address any questions you might have. Otherwise, I'm just going to go through with what I have to say. Okay, let me quickly. So I'm going to talk about minimal risk in research, and since I'm working in the U.S. at this point, some of it will be, or most of it will be framed in the normative framework that's governing research in the United States. But I think nonetheless that what I have to say is applicable much broader than the U.S., because there are some basic questions about how we should assess risk that I would like to address. Before I start, I always have to say this. Obviously, the opinions I'm expressing here don't reflect the policies and positions of the NIH and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services or any other government agency or official. So, what I'm saying are my views. I should mention, though, that I'm working on this project with David Wendler and with Zeke Emanuel, and this is still work in progress, so I'm excited to hear your thoughts as we discuss this. So it's clinical research involves risks. So when we're testing new interventions, by necessity, there are going to be some risks to those who are exposed to them for the first time. But we're not only testing new interventions in research, we also perform procedures in order to evaluate those procedures or the new interventions we are trying to test. So we're doing, things that have nothing to do with testing actually the new interventions, but with trying to evaluate its clinical effects. So blood draws or, biopsies, certain biopsies, a lumbar puncture, imaging procedures, etc. All that serves to evaluate new procedures. So inherently, there are some risks involved in research, and the primary ethical concern this raises is that in research, individuals are exposed to risk and exploited for the benefit of others. And so there's a general consensus, that's the primary concern, that risks are exposed to, that individuals are exposed to risk for the benefit of others in research. And there's general consensus that for research to be ethical, the risk of harm to the participants must not be excessive. And in all countries around the world, we set up pretty elaborate regulations and mechanisms to ensure that that is the case. So we have institutional review boards or research ethics committees that review protocols before they're actually put into practice. And those committees are make sure that the risks of the research are minimized, that the risks of the research to participants are reasonable in relation both to the potential individual benefits, so to the participants themselves, but also to the expected or anticipated social benefits from the research, so from the knowledge we expect to gain from conducting the study. And then, most importantly, in research with vulnerable populations, such as children or people who can't consent, prisoners, etc. Institutional review boards or ethics committees also ensure that risks do not exceed a certain limit. Now, in most research ethics guidance and research regulations, the one limit that everybody talks about and that delineates when research is acceptable on people who can consent on vulnerable populations is the level of minimal risk. And minimal risk, this is just taken from U.S. federal regulations, but it pretty much applies to other research guidance and regulations as well. So minimal risk has really important practical limitations with regard to what can be done in a research study. So if a research study is classified as a minimal risk study, the ethics review can be expedited, consent requirements can be modified, so including waivers of consent or, modifications of the consent procedure where we actually deceive people. So, for example, in research trying to learn about the placebo effect, and most importantly, what I already alluded to, we can enroll vulnerable populations such as fetuses or, pregnant women, healthy children, and prisoners. So really much hinges on the determination of whether a study is minimal risk or not. So what actually is minimal risk? I'm using here the definition. I would like to, the definition suggested in the federal regulations, but it's one that at least in parts you find also in other regulations. So there are lots of there are also regulations or guidance documents who just use minimal risk and leave it completely undefined, but that's not very helpful. So here I'll focus on the most prominent definition that's probably out there, and that is the one that's used in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. And there it says that risks are minimal when they are not greater than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine examinations. And what I want to focus on in that definition is the first component of that definition, so comparing risks to the research risks, to the risks of daily life, because I believe that routine examinations are just, one part of the spectrum of risks people encounter in daily life, and so the more comprehensive or the more interesting comparison is here between the risks in research and the risks in daily life. Okay, now, how is that actually, or how is this definition actually being implemented? It's kind of hard to say, okay, does this particular intervention, such as a lumbar puncture, for example, or let's say an MRI or a CT scan or something like that, is that similar to the risks of daily life? It's pretty hard to determine, and actually what you see is that it is hard to determine, and that people really have difficulties with it. So what we see, there was a study that was conducted among chairs of institutional review board committees in the U.S., and they were asked in the context of pediatric research, that is, how they would classify various interventions with regard to their level of risk. So they were asked, what do you think the risk of a lumbar puncture is? What do you think the risk of an MRI scan is? And the like. And what this study showed is that there's huge variation in terms of how people actually classify the risks of research interventions that are commonly used in research studies. And just to give you one example is to just illustrate, is allergy skin testing there was pretty much an even distribution between the categories of risk that are available in the context of pediatric research in the U.S. So about a fourth of the people thought that allergy skin testing was a minimal risk procedure. About 40% thought that allergy skin testing was a minor increase over minimal risk. This is a category I won't talk about today. And then about 30% thought that allergy skin testing was greater than a minor increase over minimal risk procedure. And I understand that Henry actually has asked all of you kind of similar questions before, in preparation for this talk. And you probably won't be surprised to hear that the finding actually is very similar. So there's lots of variation, even among a small group of I don't know, 6 or 7 people, in terms of how you would classify the risks of various interventions. And I just wanted to give you an example to illustrate the problem here. So, or the extent of the problem and the variability. So for lumbar puncture, there was actually, and this is from the 5 people who participated in this survey that Henry sent around. So for the lumbar puncture, there was no one who thought that was a minimal risk intervention. 2 people thought it was a minor increase over minimal risk. 2 people thought it was more than a minor increase over minimal risk, and 1 among you actually thought that this was an unacceptable procedure. Then regarding the confidential survey on illegal drug habits, 2 people thought it was a minimal risk procedure. 2 people thought it was a minor increase over minimal risk procedure, and there was 1 person who thought it was more than a minor increase over minimal risk. And then allergy skin testing, which I mentioned here already with data from the U.S., 3 of you thought it was a minimal risk procedure, 1 person thought it was a minor increase over minimal risk, and 1 person thought it was greater than a minor increase over minimal risk. So you pretty much find, even in your very small group, you pretty much find the same variation, or, really significant variation. And, looking back at what I said, just 2 slides ago, this is really significant because the practical implications of classifying a procedure as a minimal risk procedure are really important. It allows you to modify consent requirements, to expedite IRB review, and most notably to enroll vulnerable populations. So there's a real problem here that we need to that this finding raises, the problem is that there are basically 2 worries. One is the more obvious one is that there's too much protection going on, so that there's not enough protection going on. So research participants would be sometimes insufficiently protected from excessive risks of harm. So it might be the case that a particular intervention poses more than minimal risks. And then people say, oh no, it's a minimal risk intervention, and so those who we want to protect in research are not sufficiently protected. On the flip side of it, if you look at it from the other side, there might be too much protection and not enough research. So protection, I mean here, and kind of quotes. So when an intervention poses minimal risk, and some people actually think it's more than a minimal risk procedure, then it could be the case that studies are actually not allowed to go forward because people say, well, it's not a minimal risk intervention, and we can't really do that, for example, in children or with pregnant women, etc. So really 2 concerns, either not enough protection or, in some cases, too much protection and not enough research. And so it's really important that we try to reduce some of that variation in evaluating the risks of research. Okay, so how do we go about doing that? This is actually, I'm going to tell you about, the project I'm still currently working about. So if you want to change something, you got to kind of think about the problem first and what's the primary problem. So I think the primary problem is that institutional review boards, research ethics committee have pretty limited time to actually make risk assessments, and they don't have, enough data to actually look at it, for each protocol to look at the literature and conduct, a thorough systematic review of the literature on the risks of the procedures used in the study. And so they're really under practical constraints, time constraints, and resource constraints, and therefore they have to rely on intuitive risk judgments. And this is problematic in the sense that if you look at a huge body of literature actually in research on social psychology and risk perception that shows that intuitive risk judgments are often very biased. So they're systematic biases that influence the way we perceive risk. And I'm just going to give a few examples here. This would be, a seminar on its own if we wanted to discuss all of those. So, for example, if we think we're in control of a procedure, then we think, or of an activity, then we think the risks are lower. So, for example, the common example here is that people are much more afraid of flying than of driving. So because in driving a car, you are actually in control, even though the risks of flying are much lower. Sort of a risk involves a harm that's not reversible, such as most terribly death, then people think the risks are much higher, just because the harm is not reversible, and they forget to kind of take into account the likelihood component of risk. So that kind of ties into with the death already. There are many, many more, such as familiar risks we tend to think are less risky. We tend to be influenced by the risks that we just saw, a few days ago, etc. And tend to think those are, very risky if there's something terrible happen. So lots of factors that can influence our judgment, and this is the assumption is that this is what's going on when ethics committees review the research. So the challenge really is to improve judgments about minimal risk. And try to come up with ways of systematizing the way we think about risks and evaluate risks in the context specifically of IRB review and research ethics review. And so the project that I've been working on had two components essentially, and I only will talk about one component. So one component was just to look at the data, and you'd actually be surprised how few data there are about the risks of common research procedures, so the ones we've been talking about, lumbar puncture, various biopsies, etc. But the other one, conceptually more interesting, this is what I want to talk about, is to develop a systematic method for making comparisons between risks. So, and specifically because this is what the U.S. regulations ask for implementing the risks of daily life standard for minimal risk. So the idea here is if you have a method for systematically comparing risk, then you can, compare the risk of research with the risk of many other activities, basically on your choice. So you could compare them with the risk of routine examinations, or some people talk about, the risk of participating in charity in the context of pediatric research, that should guide our ideas about acceptable risk in research with children, etc. So how do you actually compare risks? Risk comparisons seem to be important for orienting our judgment. Some research procedures actually pose the same types of risks as daily life, such as the risk of death. To assess these procedures, we can go ahead with the comparisons in a relatively straightforward manner. So we can just compare the risk of dying in research directly to the risks of dying in daily life, because we kind of have the same currency, if you want, and then we just need to look at the likelihood of the particular event, in this case death, occurring, and then we can make a comparison. I'm not saying that is totally straightforward. There's lots to consider there, too, with regard to the strength of the evidence, etc. But it's conceptually, it's relatively simple. Whereas comparing risks that involve different types of harm is much more difficult. And that's actually the case with most research procedures, namely that they pose different types of risks than daily life, or risks that involve different types of harm. So just an example, if you perform a research bronchoscopy, it poses a risk of airway abrasion. And in daily life, the average healthy, normal person has essentially no risk of airway abrasion. So how do we liken harms that are pretty specific to the research context to harms that occur in daily life? So how do we make comparisons between harms? And this is where I think we need a method. So we need a method to compare the level of different types of risks. And to do that, it's useful to take a step back and think about what risk actually is and what it is that we are trying to compare. And a standard definition all of you will have heard is that risk is a function of the magnitude of a possible harm and the likelihood of experiencing that harm. And you will see immediately that there's different types of judgment involved here in evaluating those two components. So for harms, we require evaluative judgment. The question here is, how bad is the harm, and for whom and and whose harms should count, etc. These are all evaluative judgment, normative judgment. Whereas the probability component, that's really an empirical question, and we need empirical data for that in order to answer that question. So the idea of the method that I've been working on and developed is that it's helpful to compare different, to separate the empirical and evaluative judgment involved in risk comparisons if you want to make risk comparisons. So in order to do that, the real challenge, as we already said, is trying to compare different types of harm or different harms. So how do we actually do that? And here I think it's useful to try and not compare specific harms, but to try and classify harms by their magnitude and then actually compare magnitudes of harm. And in order to do that, you need to develop a scale of harms by magnitude. So from the spectrum of essentially no harm to the worst possible harm, such as death or life in excruciating permanent pain, how do you actually think about the different harms and divide that spectrum into manageable levels so you can classify harms by their magnitude. And in order to do that, we developed this scale of harms by magnitude, which is based on the idea that harms experiences which set back individuals' interests. This is a common definition by Joel Feinberg, a philosopher, a legal philosopher. And once you take that definition, it becomes clear that a harm's magnitude depends on the extent to which it sets back an individual's interests. And so starting from there, you can develop a typology of harms by magnitude and kind of divide the spectrum of harm into magnitudes levels. And what we've done is we have set out 5 magnitude levels. So there's negligible, small, moderate, severe, and catastrophic setback to interests or levels of harm. And this scale you can then use to make harms that are of very different types amenable to comparison. So what you then actually do in this framework that we call comparative risk analysis is if you want to know how the risks, let's say, of allergy skin testing compare to the risks of daily life, what you do is that you identify the potential harms of the research intervention, in this case allergy skin testing. Then you use the harm scale that I just described to classify those potential harms that you identify based on available literature by their magnitude, and then you compare the likelihood of each of the potential harms that you identify from the procedure to the likelihood of the same magnitude from an appropriate activity in daily life. I see someone's raising their hand, so I'm going to let the mic go and hear the question.
Okay, hi Annette. This is Rehab. I'm curious to understand. You say that you categorize the harms into different levels based on a certain magnitude, and magnitude means that you're measuring them somehow. Whereas in the previous slide, you were saying how each person or each subject would categorize that harm according to their own interests. So can you please clarify that for me?
Great question. So I must not have been clear. So there, or I guess the what's not clear here is the notion of the interests, and what are the interests that people actually have to take into account at various levels in the research process. So you're right that the individual person who's trying to decide to enroll in a study is going to take into account their very personal interests, and they depend on the personal projects the person has engaged in, the particular things they have chosen that are important to them. So they really have a very subjective view of their interests, and they take those into consideration as they decide during the informed consent procedure to enroll in the study or not. we are here, or I'm trying here to work on the level that precedes this, actually, where we're trying to figure out on the level of ethics review, so the institutional review board and or research ethics committee, trying to figure out when it is acceptable or for researchers to actually invite people into a study. And so by necessity, you don't really know what the people actually what personal interests they will have, but you will know who it is that's going, by virtue of looking at the inclusion and exclusion criteria of the study, you will know who is going to enroll in the study and who in that group what kind of interests they have. So you're trying to you make an extrapolation, and so there's some judgment here obviously involved, and trying to figure out what are the interests of the people that are going to enroll in the particular study under consideration. And this is going to drift more, not focus that much on the personal projects because you don't really know, but it's more going to focus on more the interest that the average normal person has within that group. And that's on the level I'm trying to talk about. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense, but I'm still confused about the magnitude of harm. So you're measuring it somehow. You have some unit of measurement, and you're using that measurement to categorize harms into various categories.
Right. So maybe the key here is that I'm not trying to suggest that the magnitude scale that I just described, going through the different harms by their magnitude, it's not meant to be a measure. So it's not meant to be the way you would measure, let's say, the sodium content in your blood, or the way you would measure, the size of a person or their weight or something like that. So it's not meant to be like that, but it's meant to be more heuristic for people to think about and to organize and structure their evaluative judgment that they're making about the magnitude of the harm. And there's lots of things that, just for the length of this presentation, I didn't include here. There's lots of thinking behind this. What the most important factors actually are that influence people's interests. So, and in terms of the particular harm under consideration. So it will be, the physical and emotional experience. So, the pain and possible anxiety associated with the harm. It will have to do with the impact. That's an important consideration that the harm has on the individual's ability to pursue their goals. It will have to do with the question of, does the harm, does it mean a real interruption in their life, and will they have to adapt and kind of reorganize their life, and to what extent, etc. So there's numerous factors here that influence setbacks to interest, and I don't think it's helpful to actually try and even operationalize that much further, because those factors are so interdependent that you can't really come up with one measure. But it's more meant to help people who are doing risk assessment separate, or in general, this method that I'm trying to present, separate the different judgments that are making, primarily empirical ones from primarily evaluative ones, and give them some tools, or give people some tools how to think about that. Does that make more sense?
Yes, it does make sense, but I just want to make sure that I got it right. So what you're saying is that you are assuming a certain, each harm to have a certain level or category, and you are using that scale you're trying to use that scale in the IRBs so that they can categorize the research harms using that scale to be able to make the decision, is this minimal risk or above minimal risk? but at the same time you're using some sort of probability or assumed probability so that you can come up with a likelihood of potential harm, right?
Right. I'll say a little bit more at the end of who I actually see this method using and how I think it'll go into the. I actually don't think that that it's very suited to be used, on a day-to-day basis, just because it's pretty complicated. But it's exactly right. It's trying to separate out the judgments about likelihood from the judgments about harms and the impact that harms have on people's lives. From the perspective, as you rightly said, not from each individual person, because only that person will be able to actually do that, but from the perspective more from the average person who's going to be enrolling in that particular study under consideration. I'll illustrate. There's going to be an illustration, so I think that's going to be less abstract. So maybe, unless you have a further question, I would just continue, and then we can follow up more on questions once you've seen the illustration and how this is going to work. Because I realize so far it's been pretty abstract. But let me know if there's anything further you want to ask now.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
All right, so this is actually very helpful. So we already kind of like have the essence of what we're trying to do. So separating out the empirical component of risk and judgments about likelihood and the strength of the data from the evaluative judgments about the potential harms coming about. So if you want to use that method, what you then have to do to evaluate a particular research intervention, you have to identify the potential harms of that intervention. And I was using the example of allergy skin testing here, which I will use for the illustration too, and then use the harm scale to categorize the magnitude of the potential harms, and then compare the likelihood, again drawing on the literature or the available data, and compare the likelihood of each potential research harm from that allergy skin testing in this example to the likelihood of a harm of the same magnitude from an appropriate activity in daily life. So, and I think, it sounds all pretty complex, but it'll be much clearer now, hopefully, once I show you kind of how this is supposed to work. So let's take allergy skin testing. You're probably all familiar with it. It's a test trying to figure out whether someone is allergic to various allergens, and what people do is they apply usually to the forearm. They apply solutions, allergen solutions, let's say of nuts and various pollens, etc., and bring them with a light scratch into the skin, and then see how the skin reacts. Whether there's a local allergic reaction, and sometimes if someone is really allergic, they can actually develop a systemic allergic reaction. So is that a minimal risk procedure or not is the question here. So going through the steps of what I just described, or trying to apply the method that I just described, the first step would be to actually go into the literature and look at the allergy skin testing and try to identify the potential harms associated with the allergy skin testing. And we find there are five primary harms that happen in, again, the average person. So it might be that if you're working in a particular protocol where there's a particular group of patients with particular backgrounds, that this might change. But this is more coming from like the average normal person who's going to participate in a protocol without, particular specifications. So what you find there is that there's a transient mild pain from the little incision that people, or the little incisions people have on the skin where you're trying to bring the allergen into the skin. Then people can develop a local reaction, which pretty much looks like a bee sting. So, there's itching and there's swelling involved. Or it's more like a mosquito sting, actually. Then sometimes people go beyond local allergic reaction, and they can develop systemic reactions, so a systemic response. And those can be either mild or moderate, and the mild ones involve hay fever symptoms, so sneezing, primarily sneezing and drooling of eyes, etc. And they can, but they can be stronger than that and be a moderate to severe allergic reaction where you have actually asthmatic symptoms, or people start going hypotensive and going into anaphylactic shock. And then there's, I forgot to say, sorry, for the mild systemic reaction, there might be kind of hives, so general itching or generalized skin reactions. And then if the anaphylactic shock can obviously result in death. So here's what, I think, based on the magnitude scale that I presented, what I think how these potential harms, how they should be classified. So you see that I think, transient mild pain and the local reaction are negligible harms. The mild systemic one is a small one. The moderate systemic reaction is a moderate harm, and then death obviously is catastrophic. You can also see from the literature the different likelihood estimates, and you'll see there's some variation here. It's often pretty difficult actually when you try to quantify or actually look at the available evidence to really come up with good estimates. And I did this in consultation with people working in the fields and trying to talk to them about it and how they assess the evidence. So these are the first two steps that I just described. And then what you do is the actual comparison. You go and we are now in the business of comparing research risks to risks of daily life. And so you go and identify harms that occur in daily life and look at data about those and try to estimate their likelihood. And here's kind of my wash list and what we've been using. So a negligible harm is a bruise, a minor harm, a common cold, a small harm would be a bone fracture, a severe one would be hearing loss, and catastrophic one, a car ride. And you see there are certain likelihoods that you can attach to those depending on the data that you find from various activities. Primarily it's actually sports and driving. And then you can make a comparison between the likelihoods of harms of the same magnitude. And the easiest way to do this actually is to plot a graph, and this is what I've done here. So you see in blue the risks of daily life that I just listed in the table, and then you see the potential harms and the attached likelihoods from allergy skin testing. And what you see there is that all of the likelihoods fall below, or that all the potential harms from allergy skin testing are actually less likely than risks in daily life. So on that method, and using obviously my input, so what I think about what the harm magnitudes of these harms are, the allergy skin testing would be a minimal risk procedure. Okay, I do want to say something, and I think this is not the latest version of the presentation actually that I'm just working through. So I'll deviate just a little bit here on the last slide. But I do want to say something a little bit about, sorry, I'm looking here at mine, about where I see the advantages and where I see the limitations or objections for this method. So I think the clear advantage is that it reduces the impact of the biases that I described at the beginning of the presentation, because it forces people to actually look at the data and try to identify the data that are out there on the risks of research interventions, but it also forces them to put things into perspective, and by comparing the risks in research to risks involved in other activity. By reducing the impact of biases, it promotes consistency, or the method helps promote consistency in the way ethics committees evaluate the risks of research interventions. That doesn't mean that, it's like an algorithm. That's what I'm saying here. So it's not like a magic machine where everybody will come to the same conclusion, but it should at least streamline the way people think about it and make clearer where they agree and where they disagree, and therefore also more likely to address disagreement. And again, I said that very early on, so I've used this in the context of the federal regulations in the U.S., which calls for comparisons between the risks of research with the risks of daily life, but obviously you can plug in any comparative activity that you fancy. And there's lots of people who use risk comparisons just because it's so hard to come up a priori with, a particular number of a risk as being acceptable or not. So lots of people work with risk comparisons. So that's where I think the advantages really are. There are obviously limitations and also objections to be made. So the first one I think is that obviously this does not provide kind of an independent theory for determining acceptable risk. So if we had criteria for determining when risks are acceptable, we could just apply them to the procedures. But it's extremely difficult because there are so many things that factor into the evaluations of risk, that there isn't a widely accepted theory for determining risk. And therefore, there still is some influence, obviously, of intuition and relying on intuition in determining which of the comparative activities we actually think are suited, and to compare the risks of research. And that's something I haven't talked about. That's a different talk, but for obvious reasons, there are lots of criticisms to be made about comparing the risks of research to the risks of daily life, because in daily life we usually assume risks for our own benefit. So, the risks of, driving a car, we do that because it takes us places that we want to go and we can pursue our goals and interests, etc. And research, by contrast, people are exposed to risks, individuals are exposed to risks for the benefit of others. So in many ways it's different. It's different from the risks of daily life. So there is. I'm not claiming that this is, kind of the miracle for resolving all issues or all problems we have with risk or evaluating risk. But I think it's a step forward in the absence of an accepted theory of risk. And then another big point, obviously, is that the data will always be limited, and I'm very well aware of that, having tried to review the evidence of risk from about 20 research procedures for this project. So obviously the available data will influence, the potential harms that you identify, the information you have about estimating the likelihoods, and how relevant it is. You might have data that's like 20 or 30 years old and procedures have changed, etc. So lots of problems here, and I well recognize that. Nonetheless, I think it's better to look at the data that are out there and actually also make clear if there aren't, to encourage people to start collecting more. But I think that's advantageous as to, just doing intuitive judgment alone. And then the last thing I want to address, and then I'm done, is that obviously it's very complex, so, it takes a moment to kind of get your head into this into this method. And so coming back to the question that Rehab was asking earlier, I think there might be a place for the method, in IRB discussions, if there's some intractable disagreement about, particular things that haven't been addressed before. But I think it's more likely, or that's more the vision that I have, is that there are designated committees who use the method and who take the time to systematically go through the literature and look at the risks very carefully of, common research procedures. And, they're the ones that reoccur in different, in protocols. There's like a list of like 15 or 20 research procedures that are used over and over again. And so the idea here would be that committees could look, specifically designated committees could look very carefully at the risk of the procedure in their more general conditions they're working under, and then come to something like default determinations of the risks involved in that procedure, or default determinations as to whether that procedure is a minimum risk procedure or not. And then the local IRB could look at how this applies to the particular study under review. And often there will be, obviously, risks always vary with local context. And often, and so there will be variation, but the challenge then will be to decide whether that variation is going to be significant enough to really push the normative or the normative evaluation or the normative judgment about that particular risk in a different category. And I think in more cases than not, that will not be the case. So the idea the way I would envision this is that you come up with kind of default judgments about levels of risk involved in common research procedures, and then local IRBs can use that and review that carefully, kind of use that as a default when they review particular protocols. Okay. Yeah, this is much longer than I thought. I'm really sorry. That's it from my side. So lots of questions. I already see a hand raised. I'm going to let go of the microphone.
Great project, Dr. Annette. Thank you for the lecture. And I think it would be beneficial for IRB committees. I'm reminded of the categories of the scales for pain or severity of illness, which are widely used. My question is, can you do this assessment by maybe doing a survey among physicians who do research, and maybe take the data or the results and compare it to daily normal risks? Thank you.
The connection was sometimes a little interrupted, so I'm hoping I understood the full question. You were asking about the implementation, if I understand correctly, of how that method actually could be used, or how we could kind of try to streamline, and whose input should go into developing those defaults, for example, as I described. And I think your question was whether you should survey physicians or also patients. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, that's correct.
So I think you're exactly right. I think it should be those who know best, and you identified the two obvious groups, because both physicians who do research and who know something about the procedures, they have a particular knowledge, but they don't have the particular knowledge that people who undergo them actually have in terms of what the experience is for them. So in particular for things, what's the quality of the pain, and how is the experience of the pain for me? What's the anxiety, involved in those procedures? I think you have to combine in the end. It's not going to be just like what I did today, where I said, I think this is this particular magnitude level of a particular harm. Ideally, you would have much broader input from relevant parties, and I think, yes, researchers and patients or participants are exactly the people to ask.
Let me just say at this point that I would like to say, Annette, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, and I think you've your presentation raised some good issues about risk, and more importantly, I think you helped us understand risks in a different viewpoint that I think that clarifies a lot of issues about risk assessment, and this is important because I think of all the things an IRB does, considering benefits and study design and informed consent, I really think that the assessment of risk is probably the most important and the hardest thing for IRBs to consider. So I would like to thank you for adding more clarity on this subject matter, and I want to thank you very much for doing that.